Have my timer to make sure we don't go over time. So thank you very much. It's my pleasure this morning to talk to you about some work that we've been doing for the past 10 years using self-determination theory principles to build a large course transformation program to create autonomy-supportive environments. The program is called IMPACT. It stands for Instruction Matters, Purdue Academic Course Transformation. I guess that's supposed to mean that the mic is not working, but now we're good. And we have been fortunate. It's been 10 years doing this work, but in the past year, we have been recognized with some national recognition from the Chronicle of Higher Education, naming IMPACT one of the 6 programs changing the culture of classroom. So we're very excited about this, especially because it's built in self-determination theory. So it's my pleasure to talk about this today. And you can read more about the program itself in those other publications that are mentioned here. We have grown from back in 2011 having only 35 of these faculty going through the program to now over 300 faculty that we've worked with in higher education, redesigning and transforming over 600 courses. And those are actually faculty in higher education at Purdue University. In terms of the students, we have large data sets. We're sending these surveys to over 20,000 students every semester. About 72% of each of the students are in an impact class, and we've had semester where it's been as high as 95%. And this is across all colleges, so all 12 colleges at Purdue. We've worked with faculty in all 12 colleges. So this is not something that works only in the social sciences or in a particular department or field. So you can think about this program as an autonomy-supportive intervention for higher education. So think of the work of John Marshall Reeve doing autonomy-supportive intervention in K through 12 mostly. We have taken these concepts and taken it to higher education, which is the sort of the key for the talk. So thanks, Jenny, for that one. So we are working with faculty in building these autonomy-supportive learning environments. We use self-determination theory principles to do so, looking at the learning climate as being autonomy-supportive, and we actually work with faculty very explicitly in that framework. It's presented as part of the faculty learning community, which is a 16-week program that goes through the entire semester. And we work very intentionally with the faculty, teaching them about self-determination theory and motivation and the basic psychological needs of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So how we do this, and this is just a schematic representation, but again, they're faculty members at a Research One institution. You cannot tell them what to do. And actually, that makes a lot of sense for us in terms of self-determination theory, is that it doesn't work anyway, and we know that. So what we do is that we work with faculty in this scholarly inquiry process. We start where they are, and we talk about the basic psychological needs and the way that it works for them, and it would also work for their students. We talk about choice of redesign. So this is not a program where you have a one-size-fits-all and everything is sort of a one-way. It's not about flipping your course. It's not about putting your course online. It's really about this inquiry process with the faculty in terms of thinking about their students and why is it that they want to do what they want to do, thinking about their learning outcomes for the course, and also thinking about what is it that are their ultimate goal, and starting where they are, really being their guide on the side, asking questions. And a lot of them through this process have engaged in research with us, testing the impact of their intervention. So it's really much more about the how and the why as opposed to the what. And that's very important. It's not about the type of technology that is used. Most of these redesigns will use some amount of technology. It's part of the way they engage students, but it's really not about the technology. It's about how you're using the technology to engage students. And I'll present some data about that. So again, there's a variety of redesign type. They all look different, but the key element is that they all focus on autonomy-supportive learning environments. This idea that the basic psychological needs of the students are met, and we ask these questions throughout the program. So when the faculty come up with an intervention, something to do in their class, we're asking them, how does it meet the basic psychological needs? And they have to write this down. So I will start with some work that we have done. This is in progress. We're working on a compilation of the studies that we have done through the past 10 years. It's about 34, maybe now 35. It may already be outdated. We're currently working on this, looking at the work that we've done ourselves and with faculty over the past 8 years. It's actually more, 10 years. And out of these articles, we have 11 that are now part of a meta-analysis, and I'll present just a few pieces of data on this. But just to give you a summary, when we have the research, the work done with the faculty, they either focus specifically on the effect of the redesign, or they look at the learning climate, the autonomy supportiveness of the learning climate as perceived by the students, and looking at the outcomes with other variables. So what we see is impact on autonomy support. We see impact on actual performance, motivation, basic psychological needs, and some other variables that they're also examining as part of their own work. We also see the same results when we're looking at autonomy support in terms of the correlations, and some are quasi-experimental design. And also knowledge transfer, this is work under preparation, a new self-report scale that we created to look at students' perceived knowledge transferability, their perception that they're able to take this knowledge and transfer it to other courses. So some results of the meta-analysis, we can see that we have actual effect on academic performance with an effect size of about 0.20. So they're not huge effect size, but we're talking about real outcomes here, real performance. And we're seeing that most of the studies that we're looking at are showing some positive results. We also see effect on perceived learning, which is also important. And for these two, we're looking at perceived knowledge transfer mostly, and also student assessment of learning gains. So we take the learning outcomes that the faculty produce in their course, and we present those to the students at the end of the semester, and we're asking them, how much do you think you have gained in this knowledge? And we see effects there too, about the same effect size. So in terms of the scope, I'll just kind of start largely. In terms of the scope of the program, the first question we've asked is it working? Are we able to create environments that are autonomy supportive with this large transformation program? We're training the faculty, we're teaching the faculty. I don't like to use the word training, but we're working with the faculty, and we're hoping that they're able to go to their class and implement those principles. So here we have 292 impact courses in this data set. And what we see here is that overall, these are the students answering the questions. We're seeing that great majority of them, about 80% of them, are seeing the environment as autonomy supportive. So they're scoring high on their learning climate scale. And we see it regardless of the type of redesigns that they're using. So we can, if we want to, separate these redesigns into two broad types. If you're familiar a little bit with the redesign literature, replacement is one where you replace actual time in class with some active learning. Could be a problem-based learning, case-based learning, or group work. And the supplemental model is one in which you maintain the large lecture format, but you supplement with online activities or other sorts of active learning strategies. We see the effect there as well, same sort of large proportion of students who are reporting these environments as autonomy supportive. So again, the idea here is that it's more important how you do it, why you do it, as opposed to what you do. It works either way. You can have a very engaging lecture, you can have a very boring one. You can have a very autonomy supportive, problem-based learning, you can have a very controlling one. So it depends. Whoops, skipped over that one. We even see it in online courses. It's a little bit more difficult. We're working on that environment right now, but we see a high percentage of agreement there as well. So what we have started to look at, to kind of dig a little bit deeper into this question, is that in the active learning literature, if you look, there's controversy as to what is it that we can do? What is sort of the recipe? So we've looked at some of these factors in addition to the autonomy supportiveness of the learning environment. And we can see that if we look at two specific one, contact hours and active learning in addition to learning environment, we'll see that the learning environment has a bigger impact on the learning outcome. So contact hours here is 1, no reduction in classroom time, 2, 5, which is 75% of the classroom time is reduced. And active learning could be, I don't do any active learning in my classroom, and this is operationalized in terms of case-based learning, problem-based learning, group work, versus I spend 75% or more of my time doing active learning. Large samples, we have that luxury with this data set, typical undergraduate students. And here are some of the results. So we can see that the effect size are small to moderate, but much more important for the learning environment on learning gains and course grade, as well as the basic psychological needs, and much more important in contact hours. And actually, active learning, and this is very inconsistent with the hypothesis, is that active learning has mixed results. So again, case-based learning, problem-based learning, it's not what you do, it's how you do it. You have to do it well. And we sort of redrive this with the faculty. It's doing it well, which for us means supporting the basic needs of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Then we have started to dig sort of deeper into this idea that we have these classes that are autonomy supportive or not through the program, but they are within a context, a larger context of a university where the type of major that people study may also make a difference. So we have done some work as well where we're looking at the impact of major on motivation. This is work that I've done with Yusher. So for example, we've wondered if there are some types of major that are more congruent with sort of the organismic tendency or basic psychological needs, like social science and humanities, which we can think about being fostering curiosity or being more consistent with life and having a high personal relevance. Versus if you're studying finance or business, the model is based in part in self-interest, in materialism, and there's an overarching goal to make profit. So there's a different mindset there. And I'm just going to focus on one of the sample here just as an example. And we have, again, large sample, about 2,000 students who were studying business-related field, and about 1,000 students studying social sciences and humanities. We looked at the academic motivation scale and also self-assessment of learning gains. And what we can see is that, as predicted, there are some differences. Students who study social sciences tend to be higher in those self-determined forms of motivation and lower in the non-self-determined forms of motivation. And what's interesting here is that if we contrast this with students studying business, we see the opposite pattern where students who are in business-related field tend to be lower in the self-determined forms of motivation and higher in the non-self-determined forms of motivation. So that's, again, sort of helping us understand that these things are within context. We have been able to also, with this large data set, look at sort of the full self-determination theory model. It's not that it's new to test a full model from antecedent to motivational mediators to outcomes, but the fact that we have such a large data set that cuts across various fields and discipline is really the contribution here. We're just going to scratch the surface, but it allows us to look at many different types of questions for different types of students, different major. Huge data set, as you can see. And some of these, this one is over time, some of these students have been in up to 7 of these classrooms answering the survey over time as they're going through their career at Purdue over a 3-year period. So here's a very complicated model. Not expecting you to read all this. If you have questions about this model, Yusher's right there. He's the one that was able to run this. I'm sure, I don't even know exactly how he did that. But we are able to test the model at the between student level, between classroom level, and within individual, within classrooms simultaneously. And what is really interesting here is that we were able to look at the effect of major on the trajectory of self-determination over time, looking at a possible moderation of this effect. And we were able to see that. Small effect size, but again, very interesting. We're talking about the growth of self-determined motivation over time, and we have impact on actual outcomes as well. But you can see that for students in the social sciences, there's an upward trajectory as they go through their program. And for business-related major, we see the opposite effect, where self-determined motivation tends to go down as they go through their program, and the overall effect is null. Again, we're finding evidence to support the overall model at all three levels, between, within, and between classroom level. But what's interesting here, and we're starting to see in many of our different research in higher education that we're conducting, is that we see a predominance of the effect of competence on self-determined motivation. And we see this not just in this particular study, but in many of the other ones that we've seen. And an absence of the effect of relatedness on self-determined motivation, or weak effect. It's weaker. And we're really exploring this in terms of what it means. There's other work that's been done recently about a sort of suppressor effect, and I'll get more into some of that result, and some meta-analysis that have been done by Vandenbroek and also Gaylord and all, and to show that sometimes we don't see the expected effect of competence, and that may be something that's just specific to higher education and maybe Purdue University, but that's something that I would call on us to continue to explore. So that also allowed us to start asking questions about the relatedness in higher education. So we've done some work, and that particular study is with 556 women, 321 male, 256 courses, 190 unique instructors, so again, a very broad data set. And we started with the relatedness construct, relatedness subscale from the basic needs scale at work, and started to look at whether that relatedness subscale could be divided into sort of two different subscale. One related more to the instructor, relatedness to my instructor, and one related more with peers. And this is something that we've heard from our faculty as we go through them with the program, is that there's a different interaction with the students, and as they create these groups, there's also something different that happens within these groups. And we were wondering, are there differential effects on outcomes such as interest, effort, and perceived learning? And we did find some differences such that the relatedness with the instructors, those items, that subscale, tended to predict the outcomes, and we didn't see those predictions from relatedness with peers. Now, this is specific to the classroom. Now, we have not looked at what's happening outside of the classroom, and that's our next step as to how do the relationship that the students form outside of the classroom, especially if you think about underrepresented minorities, for example, what does that do to the overall relatedness and to perhaps the outcomes in class? I want to get now into some things that are more brand new and not yet published. So impact is also the intervention of a grant from the Department of Education that we have called STEAM, Success Through Active Mentoring and Engagement. And it's a department, it's a FIPSI grant. Funded from FIPSI. So we've been doing this for about 4 years, and we're starting to get some really interesting data as we're digging into this. This one is focused on STEM courses, so this is a more targeted analysis. And here we have intervention and control groups. So that's one of the requirements of the grant, is that we actually have intervention and control groups as part of this. And again, the intervention is based in impact, which is based in self-determination theory. So I'm going to focus on the math courses, and I want to focus first on applied calculus. And I'm going to check time, making sure I'm still good. So here's the data set for the applied calculus course in terms of the participant. Now you can see much smaller number than what we're used to when we look at the impact program overall, but you have the data for the intervention group and the data for the lecture-based group. URM are for underrepresented minorities, and at Purdue, those would not include students from Asian background, because we have a large proportion of Asian students studying at Purdue University. And Pell eligible would be students that have a lower level of SES, so if you want, just as a reference here. We've used some measures that you're all familiar with. I'm putting them up here because this work is not published yet. And when we look at course grade, it's based on a 4-point scale. And you see how we can sort of transform these into more continuous measure. And these are preliminary results at this point. I'm going to help you point to things that I think are interesting. When we look at this model, and this is multi-level modeling, when we look at the effects of types of motivation on the outcome, either course grade or perceived transfer of learning. So here you have the actual course grade at the end of the class. And what's important here is that these are standardized assessment. They are common assessment designed by all of the faculty who are teaching this class at Purdue University. And perceived transfer is their perception of transfer of learning. We can see that intrinsic motivation tends to predict those outcomes, whether we're looking at overall or lecture-based versus intervention. And we see that identified regulation tends to only predict perceived transferability. So something really interesting here. But for math, it was really powerful for us to see that interest toward learning, interest toward academics predicted the outcome, the actual grade. What's interesting here is that we can see that underrepresented minority and Pell-eligible students tend to perform less well in those courses, but we only see the effect in the lecture-based course. We don't see it in the impact intervention course, so that made us really happy. Hopefully we can continue to do this work and reproduce, but this is starting to be our first indication that this intervention is actually contributing to reduce the achievement gap in higher education for these students, because we don't see it in the impact intervention group. We see the same thing if we're looking at the model using the basic psychological needs. Again, the effect is there in the lecture course, traditional lecture. And again, this is important. We have some lecture courses that are impact courses. Those are done with the support of the needs in mind. But in this case, we're talking about very traditional math lecture-based course. We don't see the effect in the impact intervention. This one, we see again the predominance of the basic needs for competence. And autonomy only predicts perceived transferability. For relatedness, we have something interesting that others have started to document in the literature. The zero-order correlation between relatedness and course grade is positive and small, about 0.15, but it's positive. So here what we have is looking at what we could call a suppressor effect, but others in the literature have started to talk about how if this suppressor effect happens in combination with other variables, and here we have strong relationship also between autonomy and relatedness, and autonomy and competence, is that we have to really interpret them cautiously and think about what's really going on here, right? So, and again, we don't see it in the impact intervention course. So what happens in a lecture? A couple of things that we're looking at is potentially the measure itself. So that particular measure has 2 items that are reverse scored. One says I pretty much keep to myself in this course, and the other one, there are not many people in this course that I'm close to. If you think about the lecture environment, especially if it's not designed to meet basic psychological needs, it's possible that you would score very high on that outcome, and if you are perceiving to be competent, it would not necessarily affect your grade at all, which is consistent with what's happening here, versus in the impact intervention autonomy-supportive environment, you see less of an impact here because the course is designed differently. Well, that's one option. We have others. I'm be happy to brainstorm with you. This is very new, so let me know if you have some ideas. But again, we see the effect of grade in this particular data set where the students in the impact intervention group score higher. And we also see it not just in the overall grade, but in very specific in very specific learning outcome. This one looking at the analysis, an analysis of Bloom's, an analysis item based on Bloom's taxonomy. So we see it very specifically, and this one is actually in a standardized calculus concept inventory test. So we see it not only in general, but very specifically. And here's something that's fresh off the press, and the calculus sequence. So we also see effects in sequencing of courses. So we have 4 conditions, and we have the sort of the control, and this is calculus 1 and calculus 2. A required course at Purdue, especially if you're in engineering. Time's up, we're at 6:30. And then we have the impact, which is the intervention, and then we have the crossover. So you can start with calculus 1, impact, and finish with the control, or vice versa. Now I'm going to ask you to vote. Which one you think is the worst condition? Do you have an answer? 2? You're good. It's hard to talk to an audience that is, it's actually 2, and we've seen this in 3 years of data. It really impacts competence, course grade, and this is critical. I know I'm out of time, but I'm going to take it on to question. 3.07 on a 4-point scale, that allows you to continue into your major, not have to redo courses. A 2.5, that means you have to redo at least a course. You're not going to graduate on time. So although this looks like a very small effect, it's absolutely dramatic for our students. The best condition is intervention. We see it also in the failure rate. This is the rate of getting a letter D, F, or W. Again, intervention control is by far the worst. This is an average of the 3 years. 1 year was up to 22%. And we see a good result from intervention, cutting this DFW in half. So thank you for my team. There's no way that we do this on our own, but I just want to sort of call us to action here. Now that we know that we have these interventions that are powerful, that we can implement in higher education, and we need to do something about it. We need to intervene. So my work is also policy change work, and I want to thank you for your time and your attention, and thank you.